One. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of MAGA Daily Digest. I am your host, Lionel Washington. I'm coming to you with an exclusive interview tonight from a January 6th Patriot, a real life hero from January 6th. His name is Paul Hodgkins. He was actually one of the first people to be indicted and convicted from the Department of Injustice. And I'm just thankful that we get to hear the truth from somebody who was actually there. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is Paul Hodgkins. I just want to, give an opportunity for him to tell his story and let us hear the truth of what happened. So, Paul, can you talk about like what led up to January 6th and what motivated you to go to Washington D.C. and protest in the first place?
Yeah. Yes. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the show. It's so great to meet you here, be able to speak with your audience. And yeah, so going up to January 6th, I had been very strong supporter of President Trump since the start of his campaign. I had worked very hard as a team leader, volunteer in his campaign throughout 2020. 2020 was a pretty treacherous and very interesting year to live through. I think put all of us in a pretty tense place as it was getting done.
Right.
After the 2020 election went the way it was, I felt was living in a pretty dreary time for a while there. Initially, when the rally on January 6th was coming up, I really wasn't going to go to it. Other Trump supporters from the area I'd worked with so much had really, really encouraged me to go. And I had said, look, I really feel as hurt and depressed over this as can be. Look, I really don't feel I can do this anymore. I mean, what am I going to do? Take time from my job, travel far away and to what? Wave a flag around out in the cold, probably just to have my heart broken all over again. But after enough friends had said the right things, telling me what a historic day this is going to be, this really could be the thing that really tips the iceberg. Uh, I just said, all right, I'm going to come. And last minute, I had found from another Trump support circle in Sarasota a bus heading north. Going up to the rally that had a package deal, I grabbed last minute, made the trek, and yeah, I was eager. I knew how massive this was going to be. I remember seeing when I was traveling north out of Florida, passing Jacksonville, already seeing Trump buses and Trump trucks, already heading obviously to where we were going as well. So I knew this was going to be a huge event, and I wanted to, after, you know, showing as much strong support for the president, being a part of this cause the way I had. I really did just, felt that, all right, I'm going to be here through the end, win or lose, we're going to be here for this together and we're going to go out swinging.
Yeah, it was kind of like January 6th was it was our last stand. I think anyone who was paying attention knows that the 2020 election was stolen. And it just, there were so many voting irregularities. You had the ballot harvesting, and you had this senile dementia candidate who couldn't put two sentences together. And you want me to believe that 81 million people voted for this guy? And
No,
then just the way the whole election night went about, and how if you went to bed in Florida at 11:30 at night, President Trump was winning. And then all of a sudden you wake up and Joe Biden's getting these mystery vote dumps. Come on, man.
I couldn't agree more. Until the 2020 election, the record at that point for the most votes for a candidate was Barack Obama in 2008, with just shy of 70 million, which, say what you will about him, I can understand that in that
Right.
time.
I mean, Barack
He
Obama was
inspired
overwhelmingly
America.
popular. I mean, you
Yeah.
remember the Barack Obama rallies. I mean, listen, full disclosure, I was a national delegate 3 times for the Democratic Party, twice for Barack Obama and once for Hillary Clinton. I left the Democratic Party in October of 2017, kind of just in a response to the hatred that the Democrats had for President Trump. I mean,
Yeah.
they tried to blame President Trump for the deaths of 4 American soldiers in Africa that were killed by Al Qaeda and sent there by Obama. What
Mm.
did President Trump have to do with that? And so I started looking at myself and I said, now listen, what kind of country do we live in if you can't support the president of the United States? And so that's when I decided, the Democratic Party just they were going to be against Trump no matter what he did. And then I started seeing the good things he was doing, building up our military, making America strong again, making America respected again. We had that swagger again that countries weren't just going to walk all over us. And so I left the Democratic Party. And
Well,
so
yeah,
but I do recognize that Barack Obama was overwhelmingly more popular than Joe Biden.
it's
So it
exactly
just
what
it
I
just
was.
didn't make sense that he got his 81 million votes.
That's exactly what I was getting at. There was nothing awe-inspiring about Joe Biden whatsoever. The only motivation there really was for people to get behind voting their vote for Joe Biden was their hatred for Donald Trump, and also, I suppose, tribalism to their party.
Right.
But no, I agree, and I believe that if there really was no truth at all to any of Donald Trump's concerns with the 2020 election, along with his attorneys, I really don't see him have being able to get elected in this cycle that he did,
Right.
especially to the capacity that he did. And along with that, really interestingly, had the events on January 6th not happened, uh, I think that does play an integral role into why Donald Trump was eventually elected. He wasn't elected because January 6th happened. There were much bigger reasons why, his leadership was so, favored in this cycle. But at the same time, I do believe that that's something that was very standout, from 4 years before that does play a role into why he was elected this time around.
Well, I think, people saw what was happening in America. I mean, Paul, you were a real life political prisoner in the United States of America. I mean, people thought that could only happen in a banana republic or some kind of dictatorship.
I mean, knowing until January 6th, there had been many times examples that you can give where things were protested on Capitol Hill. People may have had some kind of issue with the decision that was being voted on, or some sort of confirmation, a bill being passed had something. Sometimes protesters, hopefully nonviolent, would show up. They would make a disturbance. They would be disruptive, and usually there would be an arrest. But generally, nonviolent trespassers, protesting, these are generally fairly minor misdemeanor offenses that are generally resolved by way of a reasonable fine or
A
community
ticket.
service, not being slapped with felonies and shipped off to prison for years at a time, like many can't other defendants had been. We talk about how traumatic, my story was that to go through it. And my case and my punishment was easy compared to some of the other defendants.
Yeah.
I do not envy what some of the other defendants had to go through, and I'm really sorry for many of them, knowing what my case and what my time incarcerated was like. I really don't envy, and I'm so thankful for many of the other defendants finally being able to get some grace from this.
Absolutely. Now, can you talk a little bit about what your experience was like in the DC gulag? I mean, we heard some terrible stories, but what was it like in your experience?
Well, actually, I personally never thankfully, I never had to serve any of my time within the DC gulag, so to
Okay.
say. Never spent any time at the DC jail. Upon my arrest, I spent several hours in a cell, which is in the basement of the federal courthouse I was brought to, where I was bonded out from. I kept an ankle monitor on for the whole duration of my pretrial, where I eventually served my sentence by self surrender down at a federal prison facility in Miami, Florida, uh, where that's where again where I began in September on my birthday in September of 2021. Served my time and interestingly caught a little bit of a break. A bill you may recall passed by Donald Trump in signed by President Trump in December of 2018, called the First Step Act, which gave
Yes, absolutely.
low to minimum level inmates who completed the necessary requirements some relief and time from their sentence. This resulted in 34 days off of my sentence, and
So
I was
President
also
Trump
able to.
actually helped you twice. I mean, with
He
the First
did.
Step Act, and then with the pardon.
And 1 day off of this sentence I'm thankful for, let alone 34. And then also due to my minimum status, I was able to serve the last few weeks or month or so of my time between house arrest and first at a halfway house here in my local community. But thankfully, yeah, I did not have to stay at the DC gulag. I have spoken to a couple of folks who have. I do not envy what they went through by any
But
stretch.
let's back up for a second. You went
Yes.
through all of that because you walked into the Senate chambers, which this is supposed to be the people's building, the people's house, and and you took a selfie. That's it. You,
Uh,
you
they,
didn't.
they 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 made us think right down to what type of bracelets I was wearing that day.
You had a
But
Trump flag on, you had a Trump T-shirt on, and you took a selfie.
they
Like
they made the prosecution from the DOJ made a big stink that I had a pair of goggles on my neck. They said, "What was your intent? Why would you wear a pair of protective goggles? People don't go around on the streets wearing goggles." I gave my honest explanation for that. I was concerned about street rioting occurring, during this rally, counter protesters and, Trump supporters, like we saw in mid-December when President Trump made a motorcade appearance in DC, which became a huge clash in the streets between counter protesters and MAGA, which resulted in tear gas, a lot of battery between the protesters. I had concerns for that. That was my simple reason for bringing a pair of goggles in case we get gassed and maced by Antifa, that I'm going to have something to not blind myself. So,
because let's not forget that Antifa and Black Lives Matter had been rioting all summer long. 19 people were killed, including multiple police officers. And
rampantly in DC, by the way, rampantly.
right,
We remember the riots, the burning down of the St. John's Church in DC, many clashes where I believe I want to give a date of late May of 2020. There was a huge conflict with police in DC that day where 180 officers were treated at the hospital for injuries afterwards. Dozens more of them were treated for injuries on January 6th, but that was for a totally different reason and purpose. So therefore, that wasn't treated with anywhere near the dramatics and hostility that what happened on January 6th was, because it was for a different reason.
right.
I
And maybe
always
it's
had, I
because
always,
it was to support the Democrat agenda. And so, of course, those riots were sanctioned at a time when we were supposed to be slowing the spread and social distancing and wearing masks and stopping super spreader events. But oh, yeah, you're allowed to protest. But and that's why your story and the story of January 6th Patriots is so frustrating because it's like you have to suspend reality in order to understand the Democrat narrative. You have to really pretend that there were not riots at a time when we were supposed to be social distancing and we were supposed to be staying inside, staying at 6 feet apart. We're trying to prevent super spreader events, and that people were burning down buildings, pulling down statues of our founding fathers. They took over an entire police station in Portland. I mean, just the amount of delusion that you have to subject yourself to in order to understand the anti J6 narrative or the Democrat narrative. It's mind-boggling.
it really is, constantly, something has been brought up about a million times as a comparison for many events that we saw unfold for the 6 months or so leading up to when January 6th happened, throughout the United States, from the race riots, all stemming off, I believe, people, let's face it, people were very irritable having to live through COVID when they did, and certain things happening, brings that irritation to a head.
Right.
And it's not that I'm not trying to be unempathetic, to other people's grievances about things that went on that year. But, between mainstream media and certain politicians, their reaction to these things by comparison is what really, really bothered me. I mean, dozens of people were killed throughout the riots in the spring and summer of 2020.
Right.
Billions of dollars worth of damage in cities that, probably there's still aftermath lingering around from to this day. I do
Oh,
not doubt.
absolutely. I'm sure Minneapolis is just burnt to the ground.
No, and then this was all treated, what CNN and other outlets described as a peaceful protest. By their standards of that, January 6th was a very peaceful protest, going by what their standard of a peaceful protest is. But the reaction to it, yes, I'm sure there were arrests made in many instances, but there was no nationwide FBI manhunt that went on for years, which was documented as the biggest investigation by the FBI in the history of the Bureau. There was no, just people who committed far greater acts of violence probably walked away from it and just never ever got, any repercussions from it whatsoever. In many of these cities where we saw this happening, Minneapolis, Seattle, Chicago, the list goes on and on. Because we were standing up for Donald Trump that day, and, their derangement towards him just will make anything that we do vilified right off the bat. What type of clothes you wear, the type of foods you eat, types of music you listen to. Anybody who recognizes you as a Trump supporter and a conservative will conflate any of those things they can to you're a bad person.
Absolutely.
Not discuss your differences and beliefs, conservative versus liberal, not Democrat versus Republican, no civility whatsoever. You're a bad person. We got
No,
that
they don't
vibe from
attack
them.
your argument. They attack you as a person. And
Mm-hmm.
and that's where our politics has really disintegrated. It is no longer a discussion about ideas and policy. It is an attack on your character,
It is.
simply for who you vote for.
Absolutely. Donald Trump was the first candidate for first U.S. president we've ever had who had no prior public holding public office, and they had never served in the military. Every president we had before him had served public office prior to his presidency or had served as a high-ranking general in the military. He was the
Right.
first to come down the line that was neither one of those things. Was a successful businessman in America who, in his own words, had said America had given him so much he wanted to give something back. And he
He
was
worked
very
for free. He didn't even take a salary.
doesn't take a salary, and I think he was been an unbelievable visionary for the country as well,
Absolutely.
which also inspired people that America hasn't lived up to its potential that most people have seen. That he wants to get America to that, make us safer in ways where we've become vulnerable. And so many of his ideas and messaging really did resonate to me. But even that, you and I saying that right here, people of the left are going to conflate that we're uneducated and or stupid, or that we have bad intentions for some kind of way is our reason for being inspired by Donald Trump. Conflate that and twist that comparison to other terrible leaders that we have throughout history, and make some sort of ridiculous
As soon as they
side by
start talking
side. So
about
that,
Hitler, they've lost the argument because
yeah,
they
so
can't
that
talk about how it makes more sense to cut taxes and grow the military and secure the border. They can't, because those are just logical things. The only way that they can attack that is to conflate that with the worst people in history.
they try to refer to him and all of us as such fascists. If he's a fascist president, then I've got news for you. He's the first fascist leader in history that actually works hard to reduce the size of government. It makes no
Right.
sense whatsoever. Fascists do not reduce their government; they expand it so people living under it have no say whatsoever in what they will do. That's I
Absolutely.
don't think certainly not the American way of life. So these are reasons why Donald Trump was so inspiring. But because he was so inspiring, to things like the establishment and deep state, he is a threat. Therefore, their best way to handle this is not by just going to head on policies, but to attack him and everything that stands for him and everything that stands with him. And
Absolutely.
that has been a real struggle to get through. I do think we're seeing this time around, even though that is still there, compared to when he was elected president in 2016 and during his first term. I do sense less of that now. I do think
Yeah.
America is more united behind him as commander in chief this time.
Well, when you
The
go
first
through
time,
4 years of Joe Biden, record high inflation, taxpayer funded sex changes for illegals, taxpayer sex funded sex changes for minors, boys in the girls' locker room, an illegal alien invasion of not just 5 or 10, we're talking about 20 to 30 million people who have illegally entered our country. And I think it has exacerbated the public infrastructure, the strain on the public infrastructure.
well, for sure. I mean, one of the things that bothers me about the left the most is because that they really, really do believe and they really, really do project that they truly are the ones who are in the center of it all,
Right.
but they refuse to take any responsibility for anything that has gone wrong when the ball has been put in their court. And when it has gone wrong, and try to manipulate people to say that it hasn't gone wrong when it has. It really just did not work this time. But back to what I was saying about how I think the resistance against Donald Trump is not the mass that it used to be. The first time he was elected, the idea of Donald Trump as a president was something that most people who were against him thought never could or would happen. And therefore, when it did, when he defeated Hillary Clinton, he it was a shock. It gave a heart attack to the American deep state establishment. In fact, it just gave a heart attack to American government, altogether. It had never seen anything like this before. Didn't think it would happen. But that has happened once before. So the idea of him being president couldn't be as much of a shock because we have had him as president. Considering how much adversity he had faced in the last 8 years while he was president, and then this unfortunate gap in between, really, really is an anomaly and a phenomenon in and of itself. It would take too long in this interview for me to list off all the things that he had to overcome, to get back to where he was, and us, being united and strong. My family did not want me ever being any kind of voice or being anywhere near politics ever again after all this. My
Right.
family is not doesn't share the same views that I do, but they had felt that I should just. And a lot of people feel like I shouldn't have any kind of voice to this whatsoever. I would have been far better off to just go away and stay in a cave somewhere. And I just felt like having the story that I had and going through what I've gone through, I couldn't do that. I couldn't just stay home and be quiet. I felt like I had more of a cause and, a bigger voice in my causes now. So that's why I'm gladly here to be here with folks like you.
And I'm glad to have you because I just feel like the January 6th story, it's not being told. It's not being told from our side, from our perspective, from the people that really supported President Trump. To to the mainstream media, January 6th is like 9/11 or Pearl Harbor. Well, come on. There are a myriad of things that are worse than January 6th. The withdrawal from Afghanistan, where we lost 13 American troops, and just the catastrophe at Abbey Gate in Afghanistan. I
Mhm.
mean, it's just one example of things that are worse than January 6th. But because of the power of the media, they want to make January 6th to be out as some nationwide calamity that stacks as among the worst attacks in history, and that's just not the case. I mean, there's worse things that
No,
have happened
no,
since January
that's an
6th.
unbelievable, that's an unbelievable exaggeration by them. At
Right.
best, to even call it a riot is arguable. An insurrection, forget it. By textbook definition, this is nowhere near what an insurrection is.
You weren't
Not a
charged with
single person.
insurrection. You weren't charged with insurrection. Nobody was.
I wasn't. Nobody else was, or with a specific charge of treason or terrorism. About the worst type of charge I heard of anybody getting that day was a seditious conspiracy charge. But which even that I think was something taken out of
and that
context.
was Enrique Tarrio, and he got 20. They were going to give him 22 years,
He
and
was
he was
serving
not even
22
there.
years.
He wasn't even in D.C. for January
Nope.
6th, but they were going to give him 22 years,
No,
and
that
so
was somebody who wasn't even physically there. There was another defendant who I had gotten to know his family, Matthew Perna, who I'm sure you've heard of, who
absolutely, yeah,
tragically, from being horrified through his case, he had an enhancement in the last few weeks of his case before sentencing that was not expected, that would have given him, and up to another 6 years to serve. Somebody who was less involved than I, maybe half as involved with that as I was. Went in the hall, went to the rotunda, never got into any type of violence, and then turned around and left. And they were going to give this person 6 years. A young man who had never had no prior record, and there's so and horrified by this. This Matthew had made the really really awful decision to take his own life. To this day, I feel terrible for that. There's a handful of other defendants that have gone that same route, and then of course, the deaths that occurred that day on January 6th. Uh, and some the it's evil, the type of vitriol we've seen by some people of the left. The types of things that have been said to families who have lost their loved ones through this. It's sick. If there was anything like this, the left had some sort of major conflict over something they didn't agree with, and there was violence, people have gotten killed, like say throughout 2020. Okay.
right.
I wouldn't be taking any joy in anybody who, if there was some BLM protesters who got, 20 years in prison because they spray painted the front of a building or something like
I
that.
wouldn't
I
celebrate
wouldn't
that.
agree with that. I wouldn't agree with that. That's malicious
Absolutely,
prosecution, and
right.
it needs to be confronted. And so it's not that I'm doing any pity party for myself. What's done is done, and it's already gone by. Thankfully, on paper, President Trump had made this right for me with the pardon that he had given me 2 weeks ago. But the that like you had just mentioned earlier, things that we saw in third world countries, political persecution of people and then malicious prosecution in cases is
Right.
really was something that I think did factor into how people voted last November.
Yeah, and I just think that as as long as I mean, as long as we're talking about this comparison, yes, there were protests in 2020 and riots in 2020, but they were rioting in support of George Floyd, who, come on, George Floyd was not any kind of hero in our community. Let me just say that he was a bad man. I
Yeah,
mean, so but they're willing to burn down, spend, destroy billions of dollars worth of property over a crackhead thug. I mean, that's just all I can. That's all I have to say about that. Is George Floyd was not worth the amount of damage that was caused. Now, obviously, I don't support any kind of police brutality. I don't support any kind of
certainly not.
aggressive policing, and we don't want to see another situation like that. But I think what happened as a result of his death, he he was not worthy of the destruction that was caused in his name. That's what I'm trying to say.
He I mean, it's tough to have an opinion for that because I remember at the time everyone saying anyone who's silent about this is what the problem is. Look, I don't like what happened then. Maybe there was something handled in a way that shouldn't have been handled. I can
Right.
admit that. But like as we're saying, had he not been loaded to the gills on drugs, as autopsy has shown, going around using counterfeit money to pay for things, you never ever would have been in that situation in the first place. Granted, you didn't deserve what it got to. It shouldn't have
Agreed.
escalated to that.
Agreed.
But at the same time, I'll be, go out on a limb right here and admit, had I not decided to protest inside the Capitol building, especially the Senate chamber, I wouldn't have gone through all the things that I went through for it. Okay, I don't agree with the left's take on January 6th, But let's be real. Had I not, decided to man up and go in there to make my voice heard, I wouldn't have been punished for it.
Well, let me ask you a question about that, then. So, I mean, you didn't have to break any. I mean, you weren't one of the people that was breaking glass. I think you got there like 30 minutes later, after it had already been, they had already breached the Capitol. Did you? I mean, did you get the feeling at all that people were being let in, like they were letting people go in?
I one of the things I thought to myself when I left the Capitol building and got stood out front on the sidewalk and turned around and looked at it, I had my hand on my head and really thought to myself, I couldn't believe all that had just happened. I could not believe I had just gone through and seen and lived what I just lived right then. And it always really felt very peculiar to me how easy it was for me to do that. Now, it wasn't until afterwards I saw footage of more things that happened around and in the Capitol building. I could only see what's in my path of vision that day. But yeah, no clash with police. Open doors, I saw people flowing through. I did see some push and shove with police ahead of me inside the building, which I just backed off and said, I'm not going to do that. And wandering around, eventually being able to find the Senate chamber as easily as I did, where all but about 30 minutes ago, if that, the vice president was on detail inside
Right,
of.
right,
So this, I always thought, a big mistake that was made from that day was, the lack of security that there was at the Capitol building and how easy it was to just protest in person the way we did. I mean, they knew that the president was having a rally, within yelling distance of the Capitol building that day.
right.
He was, they knew the turnout that they had. Aerial footage shows it to be one of the most massive, maybe possibly the most massive assembly in Washington, D.C.'s
Over a
history
million
that day.
people.
Yes. And, President Trump offered and suggested and he gave his recommendation to have National Guard at the. We've seen the footage of Nancy Pelosi admitting that she screwed up, from her own
Right.
daughter's footage that she took of him. And there's a lot of blame to go around. Okay, the left would like to just blame nothing but Donald Trump, his lawyers, and then people like us, as being some sort of zombified, sheep that will believe anything that he says. We're not the
Right.
sheep. Okay, you got some real nerve calling any of us sheep at this point.
I
Uh,
survived 2020
yeah.
without getting vaccinated. So I'm not a sheep. I was not signing up for that vaccine, but go ahead.
Oh yeah. Vaccines aren't even the beginning and end of being like sheep. You can believe me. I hate to say it, but there really are some hysterical Kool-Aid drinkers I used to know that I don't anymore through all
Right.
this. But it's that day. I just can't. I just can't say that I ever. I always thought something there had gone wrong. Something seemed fishy to me while I was there inside, and then afterwards, something just didn't seem genuine to me.
Yeah,
And
it really does feel like, with everything that we know now, Nancy Pelosi's decision, the fact that it was telegraphed, months in advance that there was going to be this rally and that there was just a lack of security and just the ease of which they were able to breach the Capitol. It just feels like, and then we know that there were some feds that were, kind of sprinkled amongst the
mm,
crowd that also breached the Capitol. I mean, there's just so much about that day that feels like it was